All right, we're continuing our conversation on budgeting. And before we move on, I wanted to back up and correct something I may have inadvertently said, and that is with analogous estimating. So, personal experience with a type of project, and using that information to do an estimate can be a very accurate way of estimating a project. But that is only when that analogous project, the information from that project, is then used to do a bottom-up estimate. So for instance, if you're building a house and you know from experience the amount of labor needed to do the foundations and the masonry walls and the framing and everything like that, and you use that information on a very detailed level, you can get a very good estimate. But essentially what you are doing is a bottom-up estimate. The source of your information comes from previous experience. Whereas just a pure analogous estimate would be, oh, well, I've built a house before and it cost X amount of money, so I'm going to estimate the next house I'm going to build is going to cost the same amount. So that would be more of a rough estimate. It would be a quick way of estimating, but it's not going to give you a high level of accuracy if you just use that information in that type of a rough way. So I had said in the last video that analogous estimating or personal experience was an excellent source of information, and it is, but depending on how you use that information, you can come up with varying degrees of accuracy in your estimate. So it can be used for a very rough estimate. A parametric estimate might get you a little bit more accurate, and then a bottom-up estimate is the most accurate of these three methods of estimating. Okay, when making an estimate, there are things you need to be familiar with or aware of. No two projects are exactly the same. Even if you're designing or building the same exact building, if it's in different parts of the country, you might run into different soil conditions or different labor conditions and things like that. So there are things you need to know about the particular situation to help you make the best possible estimate. Some of those things have to do with labor. For instance, there may be varying labor rates depending on where in the world a project is being done. Especially when you start crossing international borders, the labor rate can vary significantly. That's why a lot of manufacturing is done overseas to take advantage of low labor rates. So understanding what the labor rate is in the local area, how familiar are the workers with the type of work that needs to be done. If this is something they've never seen before or never done before, it's going to obviously take them a lot longer versus workers that are very familiar with the type of work and have done it many, many times before. They're going to be much more efficient and get the job done more quickly. Is there an expectation that the workers are going to work 40 hours a week or more? Do they need to be paid overtime? How much overtime? These are all things that need to be taken into consideration when estimating a project. Some other constraints that you might be faced with when developing a project budget. Where are the workers coming from? Are you going to be able to solicit bids from third-party contractors to get the best possible rate? Or are you constrained in some way, such as using in-house workers? What type of space will be available to you? Will you have extra budgets needed in case you need to crash the schedule and pay overtime? Things like that. These are all things that need to be taken into consideration and may affect the bottom line. A common way of developing a budget is to solicit bids from subcontractors. So it's, in fact, in the construction industry, more and more, the general contractor doesn't do any of the work themselves. All of the work is done by subcontractors. But that doesn't mean that you want to completely turn over the estimating to your subs. A general contractor still needs to be very familiar with the project and understand the scope, make sure that all of the scope has been included by the sub's bid, and that their bid is reasonable. So if you got bids from a variety of subcontractors and you're generally looking for the lowest price, but you want to make sure that that lowest price does include the complete scope. You wouldn't want to accept a bid from a subcontractor only to find out that they had failed to recognize several key parts of the scope. And then you're going to get into issues of trying to negotiate, and it's going to affect the price. And plus, it's just a bad sign if a subcontractor doesn't understand the scope of a project. They may not be able to do the work completely or to the level of quality you're looking for. So, as a general contractor, you want to know essentially in your mind what a job should cost, and then compare that to what your subcontractors bring to you, and compare the two to determine whether or not your sub understands the scope, if they've included all of it, if their price is reasonable. Assuming that it is, assuming that you've gone through it and it seems like the sub has understood the scope and included everything in their bid, then you can go with the lowest price. So just like they say lawyers should never ask questions they don't know the answers to, general contractors shouldn't request bids that they don't already know what those bids should be in their mind. So once you've developed your estimate for a project, you might need to then go back and look at ways of reducing the price. In fact, this is a pretty frequent thing that happens in construction. Oftentimes, a customer wants lots of things until they find out what those things will cost, and then they realize that they can't afford everything they initially wanted, and they have to go back and revisit the design and perhaps reduce the scope, or adjust things in a certain way to try to maximize value for their dollars being spent. So that introduces the idea of value engineering, of looking at a project, looking at the methods used to deliver the project, looking at the materials, and seeing, is there a way that we could still meet the client needs, but do it in a more cost-effective way. So, so this can really be quite a savings to the customer in terms of adjusting the scope and maybe looking at other creative ways of meeting the client demands as closely as possible for the least amount of money. Activity-based costing, ABC, is it's really a way of taking those indirect costs that we talked about earlier and allocating them in a way that makes sense. So essentially dividing them up and then associating them with things like number of units produced, number of batches run, the number of products developed. So essentially, it is a way of dividing up the cost internally within your organization in a way that makes sense based on the amount of activity going on. Another way of essentially dividing up your costs internally is life cycle costing. So it has to do with spreading out that cost over the lifetime of perhaps a piece of equipment or some other type of process. And so let's say that you're a construction company and you need to buy a dump truck or something like that. So life cycle costing would be looking at the cost of that asset to your company, not just in terms of the sticker price that you're paying up front, but the fuel, the maintenance, any salvage value it has at the end of its life. So essentially looking at the big picture of what that asset is costing your company. If you took my engineering economy class, you would know that time value of money is essentially the big main lesson in that class. A dollar today is worth more than a dollar in the future. That basically comes from the idea that if you had a dollar today, you could invest it. Let's just say, for simplicity's sake, we just put it in a bank account and it earned interest. Then a year from now or 10 years from now, it would be worth more than a dollar. It would, at least its face value would be worth more. So the value of the money to the one who owns it is in getting it as soon as possible, because the sooner you get that dollar, the sooner you can put it to work for you in terms of investing in your business, um, buying more equipment, paying employees, things like that, so that they can then go out and earn the company more money. So it's something that needs to be taken into consideration for especially big projects that might last a long time. You want that money upfront as much as possible. And so if you're not going to get paid until years from now, you need to discount that, because that money that you're getting in the future isn't worth as much. You would need more of it to be worth the same amount that it would be worth today. Another thing to consider for international projects is currency fluctuations and exchange rates. So the bigger and more complicated a project gets, the more complicated it is to put a dollar figure on some of these things. So to determine your total budget, you're going to want to look at all of those costs: fixed costs versus fluctuating costs, direct versus indirect, all the different costs associated with a project, and aggregate them. Basically add them all up and look at what the cost of the project is going to be over time, and then look at your cash flow. Typically, for projects, the person performing the work gets paid periodically throughout the project. That might be on a weekly basis or monthly, or maybe only when certain milestones are met. So you need to make sure that you are getting the cash flowing in a timely manner, so that you have the funds you need to spend in order to continue working on that project. So again, aggregating costs basically just means adding up all of the costs that go into the project: direct, indirect, all those different types of costs we talked about. And you want to measure your performance as the project progresses. Are you spending the amount of money you expected to? Are you spending more money? Or are you spending less? So this is a way to measure progress throughout the project and see how well you're doing versus what was expected.